The memorandum that arrived on the desk of the Director of Military Training in November 1941 contained an order that would have condemned the British Army to continue its pattern of tactical failures. The War Office demanded immediate closure of the 47th Division Battle School at Chelwood Gate in Sussex. The institution's offense was straightforward. It taught infantry tactics that actually worked in combat. The founder's crime was equally clear in the eyes of the regular army establishment. Captain Lionel Wigram was a London solicitor wearing a uniform, not a career officer who had ascended through the traditional ranks. Regular army officers couldn't tolerate that this territorial amateur presumed to instruct the professional military on how to conduct its business. The school received orders to cease operations within 30 days, 18 months after that closure order. In July 1943, on the island of Sicily, Wigram stood watching British infantry assault a German machine gun position. The attacking platoon commander applied battle, drilled precisely as it had been taught at the now-defunct Chelwood Gate facility. The assault succeeded with minimal casualties. Wigram documented his observations in a field report that would eventually circulate throughout the British Army. Platoon and company commands have applied some sort of battle drill to knock out these enemy machine guns. Where they have done so, they have invariably succeeded in taking the position with very few casualties. The War Office had been catastrophically wrong. The solicitor had been absolutely right. The training methodology they had attempted to kill would go on to transform every Western military force for the next 8 decades. When 338,000 British soldiers evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk in May 1940, they left behind more than equipment. The abandoned materiel included 2,472 artillery pieces, 63,979 vehicles, 76,000 tons of ammunition, and 416,000 tons of stores. Equipment could be manufactured and replaced within months. The fundamental training deficiencies that had contributed to the British defeat in France couldn't be remedied nearly as quickly. Contemporary military observers noted that British soldiers demonstrated courage, equal to any force in the world, and possessed excellent marksmanship skills with rifles on static ranges. However, these same observers concluded that British forces were hardly comparable to German forces in the tactics of modern mechanized warfare. The British Army had entered the war utterly unprepared for the intensity, speed, and chaos of combat involving tanks, aircraft, and rapidly moving infantry formations. Pre-war British military training had emphasized parade ground drill, rifle marksmanship conducted on controlled ranges where distances were known and targets remained stationary, and methodical set-piece attacks that assumed ample time for planning and coordination. Nothing in this training regime prepared soldiers for the sensory assault and confusion of actual battle. The scale of Britain's training crisis became quantifiable and undeniable by September 1942. War Office records revealed that among 860 reinforcement troops posted to the 50th Division serving in the 8th Army, only 25% had conducted any field firing exercises whatsoever. 7 men had never fired a rifle at all. 131 soldiers had never thrown a live grenade. These were soldiers boarding transport ships bound for North Africa, where they would face Rommel's Afrika Korps veterans of Poland, France, and 18 months of desert warfare. German training had always maintained substantial superiority over British methods. German officers required 4 years of rigorous training to become fully qualified, including 6 months serving as enlisted men to understand the soldier's perspective, 18 months rising through the ranks to sergeant, attendance at infantry school with demanding examinations, and specialized branch training. The typical German major or captain by 1940 had participated in more multi-divisional exercises than the typical British general. German military doctrine emphasized Auftragstaktik mission-type tactics that encouraged initiative at every level of command. British doctrine emphasized methodical centralized control, where officers made all decisions and soldiers simply followed orders without deviation. Conducted annual exercises involving hundreds of thousands of troops across realistic combat scenarios. The 1937 Mecklenburg maneuvers deployed 160,000 men, 830 tanks, and 21,000 vehicles to simulate large-scale modern warfare. Between 1919 and 1937, the British Army conducted exactly 2 large-scale exercises involving Corps headquarters. The confidential 1938 Massey Report documented widespread training deficiencies throughout the British officer corps, including high failure rates in tactics and map reading among officers, who were selected based on social suitability rather than demonstrated competence. British soldiers weren't cowards, lacking in bravery. They simply lacked realistic training that prepared them for combat conditions. Rifle ranges where targets remained stationary and distances where pre-measured didn't prepare men for combat where enemies moved unpredictably, distances varied constantly, and confusion dominated everything. Grenade practice conducted with deactivated training grenades didn't replicate the weight, fuse timing, or explosive blast of actual ordnance. Section attacks practiced on empty fields with referees calmly observing bore absolutely no resemblance to assaulting defended positions, while German machine guns fired directly at attacking troops. The predictable result manifested in France during 1940. British infantry advanced in neat lines exactly as they had on parade grounds, and German machine guns systematically cut them down. British platoons bunched together instead of dispersing, making them simple targets for German artillery. When German positions absolutely had to be taken, British officers led from the front in the finest traditions of 1914 a 1918 warfare and died at rates approaching those experienced at the Somme. Junior officer casualties in France exceeded 50% in numerous battalions. Dunkirk purchased Britain precious time to rebuild and retrain. The critical question was whether Britain would use that time to fundamentally fix training problems or simply continue preparing soldiers using the same methods that had failed. The regular army's answer was unambiguous. Continue existing methods with minor modifications and refinements. One man disagreed profoundly and possessed the connections to make his disagreement matter throughout the military establishment. Captain Lionel Wigram embodied everything the regular army establishment instinctively mistrusted. He had joined the Territorial Army, the part-time reserve force. Before the war, rather than pursuing a traditional military career, his civilian profession was solicitor, not gentleman, farmer, or aristocrat. He came from a Jewish family in an officer corps still dominated by Church of England backgrounds. He wore glasses and projected an intellectual rather than martial appearance. However, Wigram possessed combat experience from Palestine during the 1930s, had studied German infantry tactics with obsessive thoroughness, and maintained absolute clarity about what British training required. British soldiers needed to experience combat conditions before facing them in actual battle. They needed to hear bullets cracking overhead, feel explosions shake the ground, and learn to function while terrified. They needed standardized responses drilled into automatic reactions for common tactical situations, so platoons could react instantly without waiting for orders. They needed to accept that some training casualties were acceptable if those deaths prevented vastly larger combat losses. None of this represented revolutionary thinking. The German army had been implementing these training principles since the 1920s. The British army had abandoned such methods after the Great War, reverting to peacetime training that prioritized appearance over effectiveness. Wigram found a crucial ally in Major General John Utterson-Kelso, commanding the 47th London Division. In July 1941, Utterson-Kelso authorized establishment of a divisional battle school at Chelwood Gate in Sussex. Wigram became its first commandant. The school's mission was elegantly simple: train infantry to win firefights through aggressive tactics and realistic preparation. The methods employed were anything but simple. The signature innovation was live fire. Training conducted with genuine ammunition. Bren light machine guns and Vickers medium machine guns were positioned on fixed mounting points to fire directly over trainees' heads during assault course exercises. The ammunition was real .303 caliber rounds, identical to what German machine gunners would fire at them in combat. The underlying philosophy was captured in a contemporary Times newspaper report. Firing live ammunition over the heads of trainees encouraged them to keep their heads down and to keep themselves properly concealed. Soldiers crawled through mud under machine gun fire set just 18 inches above ground level. If a man panicked and stood up, he died. The risk was genuine and absolutely deliberate. Training had to inflict discomfort, had to generate fear, had to replicate combat stress as closely as possible. Only then would soldiers know with certainty they could function when bullets flew in actual battle. Battle inoculation formed the psychological core of the training program. This involved controlled exposure to the complete sensory assault of combat. Explosives detonated near troops during field exercises. Pyrotechnics simulated artillery strikes landing among advancing soldiers. Exercises were conducted in smoke-filled environments where visibility dropped to just yards. The goal was eliminating what Wigram termed first-time shock, the paralysis soldiers experienced when combat began and nothing resembled their training experience. If training successfully replicated combat conditions, actual combat would feel like another training exercise rather than a terrifying unknown. Some training centers experimented with extreme psychological conditioning methods, including bayonet practice with disturbingly realistic dummies and obstacle courses, specifically designed to replicate the most horrific battlefield conditions. The most extreme of these psychological techniques were discontinued on May 24, 1942, after psychiatric evaluations determined they were counterproductive and potentially psychologically damaging. The intense live-fire realism remained standard practice throughout all battle schools. Urban warfare training represented a revolutionary departure from previous British methods. The haunted house exercise sent troops into smoke-filled buildings carrying loaded weapons with live ammunition. German figure targets would suddenly appear as squads moved through rooms. Soldiers had to rapidly identify targets, engage them accurately, and avoid shooting squad mates in the confusion and limited visibility. The risk of friendly fire casualties was real and accepted. Learning fire discipline under maximum stress was the entire purpose of the exercise. British doctrine taught what it termed the vertical technique for clearing buildings. Infantry should enter at the top floor and systematically clear downward. Troops should blow holes through interior walls to move between rooms, rather than using doorways where defenders concentrated their fire and expected attackers to appear. Canadian troops would later call this technique mouse-holing, when they employed it devastatingly effectively at Ort. The technique was formalized and taught at battle schools before any British or Canadian infantry ever used it in actual urban combat. Battle drill. Standardized tactical responses to common combat situations. When a section encountered an enemy machine gun position, every man knew his specific role without requiring orders. The Bren gunner immediately returned suppressive fire to keep German heads down. 2 riflemen worked left to execute a flanking movement. 2 more riflemen worked right to create a double envelopment. The section commander controlled the rate of fire and directed the final assault. Once drilled into automatic response through countless repetitions, sections could react in seconds rather than minutes. German platoons used similar standardized drills. Now British platoons could match them in speed and effectiveness. Training courses lasted 16 grueling days of intense physical and mental stress. Physical conditioning was relentless and unforgiving. Route marches covered 25 miles in full kit. Assault courses combined physical obstacles with live fire and explosive night exercises taught navigation and movement in complete darkness. Every single day involved live ammunition. Every exercise stressed soldiers to their absolute breaking point. Those who failed physically were immediately returned to their original units without completing the course. Battle schools existed to train soldiers who could fight effectively, not soldiers who looked impressive on parade grounds. The Instructor's Handbook on Fieldcraft and Battle Drill, co-authored by Wigram, codified all these methods in a systematic format. By late 1942, approximately 175,000 copies had been distributed across the British Army. The handbook's influence extended far beyond the official battle school system. Individual units used it to guide their own training programs. Commonwealth forces translated and adapted it for their specific needs. American forces would eventually incorporate its fundamental principles into their own doctrine. The handbook represented the first comprehensive codification of modern infantry, tactics based on actual combat experience rather than theoretical peacetime planning. The regular army establishment hated absolutely everything about Chelwood Gate. The training methods were unorthodox and departed from established tradition. The commandant was a territorial amateur without proper credentials. Live fire training inevitably caused casualties. Not many, but any training death provided ammunition to critics arguing the methods were reckless. The War Office received formal complaints that Wigram's methods unnecessarily endangered soldiers, that proper British training didn't require such dangerous theatrics, that the whole enterprise reflected poorly on traditional training establishments. In November 1941, merely 4 months after Chelwood Gate opened its doors, the War Office ordered it permanently closed. The official justification cited organizational reorganization. The actual reason was pure institutional resistance to change imposed by an outsider. Regular officers had trained infantry one particular way for 20 years. They absolutely refused to accept that a London solicitor could legitimately tell them they had been fundamentally wrong for 2 decades. The Canadian Army thought very differently about Wigram's innovations. Canadian officers had attended Chelwood Gate demonstrations and observed the results firsthand. When the War Office shut down Wigram's operation, Canadian forces kept printing and distributing the battle drill manuals surreptitiously. Canadian units established their own battle schools explicitly using Wigram's methods. The Calgary Highlanders had attended the 47th Division battle drill demonstration on October 8, 1941. They subsequently established their own school at Burn, cycling their entire battalion through in 2 complete rotations. Vindication arrived from an unexpected but powerful source. Lieutenant General Bernard Paget was appointed Commander-in-Chief. Home Forces in December 1941, Paget had personally observed and admired the work of the 47th Division in Sussex. He had witnessed Wigram's methods and practical application. More importantly, Paget recognized that British infantry desperately needed exactly what Wigram was teaching. In early 1942, Paget issued orders establishing battle schools in every division throughout the British Army. The War Office couldn't ignore a direct order from the Commander-in-Chief. Home Forces battle schools became official British Army policy virtually overnight. Winston Churchill himself visited the GHQ Battle School at Barnard Castle on December 4, 1942. The Prime Minister personally watched soldiers training under live fire, observed them assaulting positions while machine guns fired directly overhead, and witnessed the combination of controlled aggression and tactical discipline the training instilled. Churchill enthusiastically approved. Political backing from 10 Downing Street, definitively ended all institutional resistance from conservative elements within the War Office. By mid-battle schools operated throughout the United Kingdom, Brecon in Wales became the permanent infantry battle school, an establishment that continues operating today. Every infantry division maintained a divisional battle school. Specialist schools taught combined arms tactics, integrating infantry with armor and artillery. The system created capacity for 800 troops training simultaneously at major facilities. Monthly throughput reached thousands of soldiers. Cycling through standardized courses, the training genuinely hurt soldiers and accidents inevitably occurred. At Achnacarry in Scotland, where British commandos trained alongside American Rangers, training casualties occurred throughout the war, with estimates suggesting approximately 40 British commando recruits died in training accidents. 100 of the 600 American volunteers failed to complete Achnacarry training and were returned to their units. The underlying philosophy was brutal but mathematically defensible. Better that men die in training while learning to survive than die in combat because inadequate training failed to prepare them. General George Marshall visited was profoundly impressed by what he observed, and ordered formation of American commando units based explicitly on British training methods. The true test of battle school effectiveness wasn't training statistics or throughput numbers. It was combat performance against veteran German forces. Sicily, in July 1943, provided that definitive test. Wigram deployed to the Mediterranean theater as a training observer. His role involved evaluating how British infantry actually performed in combat and weather battle. Drill methods successfully transferred to real operations. Sicily represented the first major Allied invasion of Axis-occupied Europe since the Dunkirk evacuation. British infantry would face experienced German defenders fighting on prepared defensive terrain. If battle drill training genuinely worked, the evidence would appear in casualty rates and objective capture speeds.